I heard my son-in-law whisper, "She'll die before she spends it all. Better to just wait," and in that moment, something inside me went very still. I didn't turn my head. I didn't blink. I simply kept my eyes on the polished oak table in front of me, tracing the grain with quiet attention as if nothing had happened. That was his first mistake. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of place where lives were quietly rearranged with signatures and sealed envelopes. I had arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, sitting in the high-backed chair at the end of the table, my handbag resting neatly on my lap, my posture straight despite the long drive across town. At 68, I had learned that how you carried yourself often said more than anything you could speak. Emily came in a few minutes later, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, Daniel just behind her, his hand resting lightly on her back like he was guiding something fragile, something he owned. They smiled when they saw me, the kind of smiles that looked right from a distance but felt hollow up close. "Mom," Emily said, leaning in for a quick hug that barely touched my shoulders, "traffic was awful." I nodded, offering a small smile of my own. I had driven the same roads. They hadn't seemed so difficult. Daniel took his seat across from me, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease, his watch catching the overhead light in a brief, deliberate flash. He avoided my eyes, but not in a shy way. It was something else. Something calculated. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, entered shortly after, carrying a folder thick enough to hold the weight of a lifetime. He greeted each of us politely, but when his gaze met mine, it lingered for just a second longer, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't, not yet. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. I had spent 43 years building a life with my husband, Robert. Every dollar, every decision, every quiet sacrifice had been part of something we created together. And now, all of it sat inside that folder. As Mr. Harrison began speaking, his voice steady and measured, I noticed Daniel lean slightly toward Emily, his chair shifting just enough to close the space between them. That was when he said it. Soft. Careless. Certain. He thought no one else could hear. But I did. Every word. I felt it land, not like a blow, but like a confirmation. A missing piece sliding into place. For years, I had explained away the small things. The suggestions that felt more like instructions. The decisions made without me. The way my opinions were acknowledged, then quietly ignored. Sitting there, listening to the legal language unfold, I realized this moment wasn't sudden. It was the result of something that had been building for a long time. I kept my expression calm, my breathing even. I even reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a slow sip as if I were simply another participant in a routine meeting. Across the table, Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his confidence settling in like he had already won something that hadn't yet been given. Emily nodded along to the lawyer's words, her attention fixed on the document, not once looking in my direction. They were waiting. Not for the reading to end. Not for clarity or closure. They were waiting for something else entirely. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining it. I wasn't. I set the glass back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. Small things mattered. Details mattered. And now, so did every word, every glance, every silence in that room. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe you don't see them clearly. Let them think you're exactly what they need you to be. Harmless. Unaware. Temporary. I sat there, listening, watching, and for the first time in a very long time, I understood exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I understood where they thought I stood. That difference, that was where everything was about to change. The lawyer continued reading in that same steady tone, each sentence carefully measured, each clause placed exactly where it belonged, but I was no longer listening for the words themselves, I was listening for reactions, for the subtle shifts that reveal far more than language ever could, and Daniel was not subtle. He leaned forward slightly when certain assets were mentioned, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again, as if he had caught himself, while Emily kept her eyes fixed on the document in front of her, nodding at appropriate moments, playing her role with practiced ease. And I realized then that whatever expectations they had walked into that room with, they were not small ones, they were not hopeful, they were certain, and certainty like that does not come from guessing, it comes from planning, from quiet conversations held behind closed doors, from assumptions made over time. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers, not from fear, but from clarity, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Mr. Harrison turned a page, the soft sound of paper against paper echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, and when he paused briefly, adjusting his glasses, I caught it again, that glance in my direction, brief but deliberate, as if he were checking whether I understood something that had not yet been said out loud. I held his gaze for just a moment longer this time, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to let him know that I was paying attention, that I was present, that I was not as distant from this process as the others might believe. Daniel shifted in his chair. Again, crossing one leg over the other, his shoe angled toward the table, relaxed, comfortable, confident, the posture of someone who believed the outcome was already in his favor, and I wondered how long he had felt that way, how long he had been waiting, not for this reading, but for something else entirely, something inevitable in his mind. I let my eyes drift briefly to Emily, my daughter, my only child, the one I had raised through long nights and careful choices, the one I had protected. Even when it meant stepping back from my own needs, and now she sat there, composed, aligned with him, not looking at me, not once, and that absence said more than anything she could have spoken. It was not hostility, it was something colder, something quieter, it was indifference, and indifference, I had learned, was far more dangerous than anger, because anger still acknowledges you, indifference erases you. I took another slow breath, letting it settle in my chest, steady and controlled, and I adjusted the sleeve of my blouse, smoothing the fabric as if that small act could anchor the moment, could give shape to something that had suddenly become very clear. The room had not changed, the furniture was the same, the light filtering through the tall windows remained soft and consistent, but the meaning of everything in that space had shifted. This was no longer just a reading, it was a reveal, not of the will itself, but of intentions, of expectations, of the roles each of us had been assigned without discussion. And I understood now that they believed my role was nearly finished, that I was a temporary presence in a long-term plan, something to be managed until it naturally concluded. I lowered my gaze again, not out of submission, but out of choice, because there is power in choosing when to be seen and when to remain unnoticed, and for now, unnoticed was exactly where I needed to be. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly and continued, his voice unchanged, but I could feel something building beneath the surface, not in the document, but in the room itself, in the unspoken tension that only I seemed fully aware of, and as Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. Just for a second, thinking no one was watching, I realized that he had already made his second mistake. He believed this moment belonged to him, he believed the future was something he could simply wait for, but he did not understand that I was no longer waiting, I was observing, I was remembering, and most importantly, I was deciding. Mr. Harrison turned another page, his voice continuing with the same careful precision, but this time there was a subtle shift, something almost imperceptible unless you were listening for it, and I was, because by now I understood that what mattered was not just what was written, but how it was being revealed. The cadence of his words slowed slightly, as if he were choosing each phrase with greater intention, and I noticed Daniel straighten just a fraction, his attention sharpening, his earlier ease tightening into focus, like someone leaning closer to hear the part that truly mattered. Emily mirrored him in a quieter way, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, her posture composed but no longer relaxed, and I realized they were both waiting for confirmation, for validation of something they had already decided was theirs. I let my gaze rest on the folder in front of Mr. Harrison, not reading, not reaching, simply observing, because the truth has a way of revealing itself when you give it enough space, and for years I had given them space to speak, to decide, to guide, believing that trust was something that grew stronger when it was not questioned, but now I could see the shape of that trust more clearly. It had not been shared, it had been used, and the realization did not hurt the way I might have expected. It did not come with a sharp edge or a sudden sting, it settled instead, quiet and firm, like a weight placed carefully into my hands, something I could choose to carry or set down. Mr. Harrison paused again, this time longer, adjusting the papers in front of him, and when he spoke, his tone remained neutral. But there was something beneath it, a layer of intention that had not been there before, and I saw it land in Daniel first. his eyes flickering with something quick and unreadable before. Returning to that controlled expression he wore so well, Emily shifted slightly in her chair, her gaze dropping for just a second before returning to the document, and in that small movement, that brief hesitation, I saw uncertainty, not doubt in the outcome, but uncertainty in the details. As if there were parts of this they had not fully accounted for, I folded my hands more deliberately now, feeling the smooth fabric of my sleeve beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present moment. Because this was not about the past anymore, not about what had been given or taken or assumed, this was about what was unfolding right now, in this room, in this quiet exchange of words and glances, and for the first time, I felt a sense of distance from it all, not detachment, but clarity, the kind that allows you to see patterns where before there had only been isolated moments. I remembered the conversations that had ended just a little too quickly when I entered the room, the decisions that had been presented to me as if they had already been made, the way suggestions had slowly become expectations, and expectations had turned into quiet dismissals when I did not immediately agree. None of it had seemed significant on its own, but together, they formed something unmistakable, something intentional. Daniel shifted again, this time leaning back with a faint exhale, as if reassuring himself that everything was proceeding as planned, his confidence returning in small, visible ways, the slight lift of his chin, the relaxed set of his shoulders, and I understood then that whatever he believed was coming next, he had already accepted it as his reality. He was not preparing for possibilities. He was waiting for confirmation, and that difference mattered, because confirmation can be denied. I let my eyes move once more to Emily, and for a brief moment, our gazes almost met, but she looked away just before they did, her attention returning to the table, to the document, to anything that did not require her to acknowledge me directly, and that was when it became undeniable, not just what they expected, but what they had chosen. I sat there, still and composed, allowing the moment to continue without interruption, because there are times when silence is not absence, it is preparation, and as Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice steady and deliberate, I realized that whatever they believed this moment to be, whatever outcome they had quietly built in their minds, it was about to meet something they had not considered, not yet, and I did not need to rush it, I did not need to reveal anything, because the most powerful shifts do not announce themselves, they arrive quietly, and by the time they are understood, it is already too late to change them. The room remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of Mr. Harrison's voice, but my mind had already begun moving elsewhere. Not away from the moment, but deeper into it, tracing back through the years with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, because sometimes the truth is not hidden, it is simply ignored until it becomes impossible to overlook, and as I sat there, listening without truly hearing, I began to see the pattern more clearly than ever. I remembered the afternoon Emily first introduced Daniel to me, the way he had shaken my hand firmly, his smile warm, his words respectful. He had called me Mrs. Collins at first, then Margaret after I insisted, and I had appreciated that small adjustment, that willingness to meet me halfway. It had seemed genuine, at least at the time, and I had wanted to believe it was, because belief is easier than suspicion, especially when it comes to family. I had welcomed him into our home, into our routines, into the quiet traditions that Robert and I had built over decades, Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, simple moments that carried more meaning than they appeared to hold, and for a while, everything had felt right, or at least close enough to right that I did not question it. Daniel was attentive, helpful even, offering to fix small things around the house, asking questions about Robert's work, listening with what seemed like real interest, and Emily had been happy. That was what mattered most to me. Her happiness had always been the measure by which I judged everything else, so when she smiled, I accepted what came with it, including him. But over time, the small shifts began, subtle at first, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, and I was not then. Decisions about holidays started to change, plans were made without asking me, then presented as if they were already agreed upon. Conversations would pause when I entered the room, then resume with a different tone, lighter, less revealing, and I told myself it was normal, that young couples needed space, that I should not interfere, that my role was to step back, to allow them to build their own life without feeling watched or guided, and so I did. I stepped back, again and again, each time giving a little more space, a little more silence, believing that respect would be returned in kind, but respect, I was beginning to understand, had not been the currency in this relationship. Something else had been exchanged instead, something quieter, less visible, I thought about the day they asked for help with the down payment on their house, how Emily had sat beside me at the kitchen table, her hand resting lightly over mine, her voice soft, explaining how much it would mean to them, how it would give them stability, a future, and I had not hesitated, not for a second, because that is what you do for your child, you support them, you give what you can, trusting that it strengthens the bond between you, not weakens it. Daniel had thanked me that day, sincerely, or at least convincingly so, and for a while, I believed that gratitude would remain, but gratitude, like so many things, can fade when it is no longer needed. Sitting there now, in that quiet office, I could see how each of those moments had led here, not by accident, but by accumulation. Small choices layered over time, creating something that felt inevitable only because I had not stopped it sooner. I had mistaken silence for harmony, distance for respect, and now, as I listened to the measured unfolding of Robert's final wishes, I realized that what I had thought was a shared understanding had never truly been shared at all. It had been shaped, guided, and quietly redirected, and I had allowed it, not out of weakness, but out of trust, and trust, when placed in the wrong hands, does not break loudly, it erodes slowly, until one day you find yourself sitting across from people you thought you knew, realizing that they have been waiting for something you never imagined they would want, and that realization did not shake me, it steadied me, because once you see the full picture, you are no longer guessing, you are no longer hoping, you are simply deciding what comes next. And as Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice unchanged, I sat there with that understanding settling into place, not as a burden, but as a foundation, something firm beneath me, something I could finally stand on without hesitation. Mr. Harrison's voice continued, steady and deliberate, but now every word seemed to carry a weight that extended beyond the document itself, as if each sentence was quietly testing the expectations in the room, and I could feel that tension begin to shift, subtle at first, but unmistakable once you noticed it. Daniel leaned forward again, his earlier confidence returning in small, controlled movements, his fingers interlacing on the table as though he was preparing to receive something he had already claimed in his mind, while Emily sat straighter beside him, her expression composed but her breathing just slightly more measured, and I realized they were both listening differently now, not with curiosity, but with anticipation, as if they were waiting for a specific line, a specific confirmation that would validate everything they had quietly built between them. I kept my posture unchanged, my hands resting calmly in my lap, but my attention sharpened with each passing moment, because I could sense that we were approaching something important. Not because of what was being said, but because of how they were reacting to it. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses again, a small, familiar gesture, and then he paused, not long, but long enough to create a space where expectation could settle, and in that pause, I saw it clearly. Daniel's eyes flickered toward Emily, just for a second, a silent exchange, a question and an answer without words, and Emily gave the slightest nod, barely noticeable unless you were looking directly at her, and I was, because by now, every glance mattered, every movement told a story that the document itself did not. I felt something settle deeper within me then, not anger, not even disappointment, but a kind of quiet understanding that changes the way you see everything that follows. Because once you recognize intention, you no longer interpret actions the same way, you see them for what they are, not what you hoped they might be. Mr. Harrison resumed speaking, his tone unchanged, but there was a firmness now, a precision that suggested we had reached a section that required careful attention, and Daniel's posture shifted again, this time leaning in slightly closer, his focus narrowing, his earlier ease replaced by something more intent, more invested, and I could almost see the calculation behind his expression, the way he measured each word against his expectations, checking, confirming, aligning, as if he were matching the reality in front of him to the version he had already accepted. Emily remained quieter, her eyes fixed on the document, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, a small detail, but enough to reveal that she, too, was aware of the significance of what was coming. I let my gaze move briefly to Mr. Harrison, and again, just for a moment, our eyes met, and this time there was no question in his expression, only acknowledgement, as if he understood that I was no longer simply present, I was engaged, aware, ready, and that silent recognition settled something in me, something that had been uncertain before, because it confirmed that whatever was about to unfold, I was not the only one who saw it clearly. I returned my gaze to the table, allowing the moment to continue without interruption, because there was no need to rush, No need to reveal anything prematurely. The power in a moment like this comes from timing, from allowing others to move forward in their certainty until they have gone too far to step back. Daniel exhaled quietly, a controlled release of tension that suggested he believed the outcome was aligning with his expectations, and I realized then that he had already accepted a version of the future that had not yet been confirmed. He was not preparing for different possibilities, he was waiting for validation of a single one, and that certainty, that quiet confidence, was built on something fragile, something that had not yet been tested. I adjusted my sleeve again, smoothing the fabric with a steady hand, grounding myself in the present, because this was the moment where everything began to shift, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that would change the direction of everything that followed. And as Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice calm and unwavering, I understood that whatever they believed was about to happen, whatever outcome they had quietly claimed as their own, it was about to meet a reality they had not prepared for, and I was ready to let that realization unfold exactly as it should, without interference, without warning, because sometimes the most powerful response is not to stop someone from making a mistake, but to let them continue until the mistake reveals itself completely. Mr. Harrison's voice slowed just slightly as he reached the next section, and this time the pause before he spoke was longer, deliberate, as if he understood that what came next would not simply be heard, it would be felt, and I saw it immediately in Daniel. The way his posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before he leaned forward again, trying to maintain that same quiet confidence, but something in his expression had shifted, something small but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface. Emily noticed it too, her fingers tightening again against the table, her shoulders no longer as relaxed as they had been minutes before, and for the first time since we had all sat down, she glanced in my direction, not fully, not directly, but enough to acknowledge that I was still here, still part of this moment, and I held that space without reacting, without offering anything in return, because sometimes the absence of a response says more than any words ever could. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly and continued, his tone steady, but now there was a weight behind it, a precision that made every word feel intentional, and as he read, I watched Daniel carefully, not the version of him he wanted others to see, but the version that revealed itself in small, unguarded moments, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers stopped moving altogether, the way his breathing changed, slower, more controlled, as if he were adjusting to something unexpected, and I understood then that whatever he had been waiting for, whatever certainty he had built in his mind, it was beginning to slip, not completely, not yet, but enough to unsettle him, enough to force him to reconsider. Emily shifted in her seat again, this time more noticeably, her composure still intact, but her attention no longer fixed solely on the document. She glanced briefly toward Daniel, searching for reassurance, and when he did not immediately meet her gaze, something in her expression changed, just for a second, a flicker of doubt that passed as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough, because doubt, once introduced, does not disappear easily, it lingers, it grows, it reshapes expectations in quiet ways. I lowered my gaze again, focusing on the smooth surface of the table, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not the time to step forward, it was the time to let them move, to let them reveal themselves fully, to let their assumptions carry them exactly where they needed to go. Mr. Harrison turned another page, the sound soft but final, and when he spoke again, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only clarity, and I felt it settle into the room like something tangible, something that could not be ignored or reinterpreted. Daniel exhaled quietly, but this time it was not controlled, not measured, it was instinctive, a reaction to something that had not aligned with what he expected, and in that small, unguarded moment, I saw the truth more clearly than ever. He had not been preparing for multiple outcomes, he had been relying on one, and now that it was shifting, he did not yet know how to adjust. Emily straightened slightly, her eyes returning to the document, but her earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more uncertain, and I realized that whatever foundation they had built their expectations on, it was no longer as stable as they believed. I remained still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because this was not about reacting, it was about understanding, and understanding gives you something far more valuable than any immediate response. It gives you control over what comes next. Mr. Harrison's voice continued, steady and unwavering, but now every word seemed to draw a clearer line between what had been assumed and what was actually true. And as that line became more defined, I could see the shift happening in real time, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, the kind of shift that changes everything without needing to announce itself, and I allowed myself a quiet breath, steady and controlled, because I knew that whatever came next, whatever realization was about to fully take shape, it would not require me to say a single word, it would speak for itself, and by the time it did, there would be no misunderstanding left to correct. Mr. Harrison's voice did not rise, did not fall, but something in the room had already changed, and now it was no longer subtle, it was present in every small movement, every glance that lingered just a second too long, every breath that was no longer evenly controlled. Daniel shifted again, but this time there was no attempt to disguise it. His shoulders tightened, his posture no longer relaxed but held in place, as if he were bracing against something he could not yet fully understand. His eyes moved quickly across the document, not reading in detail, but searching for confirmation, for something familiar that would restore the certainty he had walked in with. But it was not there, and I could see that realization forming, slowly but unmistakably. Emily sat beside him, her composure still intact, but her stillness was different now. It was no longer calm, it was cautious, her fingers no longer pressed firmly against the table, but resting there, uncertain, as if she were waiting for something to anchor her again. I remained exactly as I had been, my hands folded, my posture straight, my expression neutral, because there was no need to move, no need to speak. Everything that needed to be revealed was already unfolding. Mr. Harrison turned another page, and the sound seemed louder than before, sharper, final, and when he continued, there was no pause this time, no space for interpretation, only clarity, and that clarity settled into the room like a quiet wait. Daniel inhaled, a little too quickly, then exhaled just as fast, the rhythm broken, and for the first time since we had all sat down, he looked directly at Mr. Harrison, not with confidence, but with expectation, the kind that comes when someone realizes they may have misunderstood something important. Emily followed his gaze, her expression shifting slightly, not enough for anyone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for me, because I had spent years reading her in moments just like this, when she was trying to remain composed while something unsettled her beneath the surface. I let my eyes rest briefly on them both, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to observe, to confirm what I already understood. They had built their expectations on something incomplete, something assumed, and now that assumption was unraveling, not dramatically, not all at once, but piece by piece, in a way that left no room for denial. Mr. Harrison continued speaking, his tone steady, but the meaning of his words now carried a precision that cut through any remaining uncertainty, and I saw it land, not in a single moment, but in stages. Daniel's posture shifting again, his confidence giving way to calculation, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to adjust, to reinterpret, to find a new angle that would restore control. Emily's breathing becoming more measured, her shoulders lifting just slightly as if she were holding something in place, something fragile that might slip if she let go, and I understood then that this was the moment where everything changed, not because of what was being taken away, but because of what was no longer guaranteed. Certainty had been replaced with possibility, and possibility, unlike certainty, cannot be controlled. I adjusted my sleeve once more, a small, deliberate movement that grounded me in the present, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something they had not anticipated, something they had not prepared for, and as Mr. Harrison's voice continued, calm and unwavering, I allowed myself to remain exactly where I was, silent, composed, and fully aware, because there is a kind of strength in not reacting, in allowing others to reveal themselves completely before you decide how to respond. And now, as the room settled into this new reality, I knew that whatever came next would not require force, it would not require confrontation, it would require patience, precision, and the understanding that the balance had already begun to shift, whether they realized it yet or not. Mr. Harrison's voice reached a point where the words no longer felt like a continuation, but like a reveal, something that had been carefully positioned to arrive exactly at this moment, and I felt it before I fully processed it, the shift in tone, the deliberate emphasis, the quiet certainty behind each phrase, and I saw it land instantly, Daniel's expression tightening in a way he could not completely control, his confidence no longer present, replaced by something sharper, something searching, as if he were trying to grasp onto a version of events that was slipping away from him. Emily turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, but enough to seek reassurance, and when he did not offer it, when he did not meet her gaze immediately, the space between them changed, subtle but undeniable. Like something unspoken had suddenly become visible. I remained still, my hands resting exactly where they had been, my posture unchanged, because this moment did not require movement, it required awareness. Mr. Harrison continued, his tone calm, but now unmistakably firm, and as the meaning of his words settled into the room, I understood exactly what Robert had done, not through grand gestures, not through dramatic declarations, but through structure, through precision, through a quiet understanding of human nature that only time and experience could shape. Daniel leaned forward abruptly, then caught himself, forcing his posture back into something more controlled, but the movement had already said enough. It revealed the crack, the moment where expectation had collided with reality and failed to hold. Emily's fingers tightened again against the edge of the table, her composure still present, but thinner now, more fragile, as if it required effort to maintain, and I could see it clearly. They were no longer certain, they were adjusting, recalculating, trying to find ground where they believed there had always been solid footing. Mr. Harrison paused briefly, allowing the weight of what had just been read to settle, and in that silence, everything became clearer. Daniel's eyes moved quickly across the document again, searching, confirming, denying, his mind working to rebuild something that had just been dismantled. Emily lowered her gaze, her shoulders drawing in slightly, not in defeat, but in hesitation, as if she were beginning to understand that the outcome she had accepted so easily was not as fixed as she believed. I took a slow breath, steady and measured, feeling the clarity settle deeper within me, because this was not surprise, not for me, not anymore. This was confirmation, the final piece of something I had already begun to understand. Robert had seen it, he had recognized the pattern, the quiet shifts, the subtle changes that I had explained away, and he had responded in the only way that mattered, not with confrontation, not with words, but with preparation, with intention, with a structure that could not be easily undone or misinterpreted. Daniel shifted again, this time unable to fully hide it, his hand moving slightly on the table, then stilling, as if he had realized that every movement now carried meaning, every reaction was being seen, and I understood then that the balance had changed completely, not because something had been taken from them, but because something they believed they controlled had never truly been theirs. Mr. Harrison resumed speaking, his voice steady, but now every word reinforced that shift, clarified it, made it impossible to ignore, and as that realization settled fully into the room, I allowed myself the smallest internal acknowledgement, not satisfaction, not triumph, but recognition, because this was not about winning, it was about truth revealing itself exactly when it needed to, and for the first time since we had all sat down, I felt no uncertainty at all, only clarity, only the quiet understanding that whatever they had been waiting for, whatever outcome they had built their expectations around, it had already changed, and they were only just beginning to realize it. The room did not return to what it had been, not after that moment, not after the words had settled into something real, something that could not be reshaped or softened, and I could see it clearly now, not just in Daniel, but in Emily as well, the way they both sat differently, the way certainty had been replaced with calculation, with caution. Daniel no longer leaned forward with quiet confidence, instead he sat back, but not in ease, in restraint, as if he were holding himself in place, preventing any reaction that might reveal too much. His eyes moved again across the document, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he were trying to understand not just what had been said, but what it meant for him, for the future he had already begun to imagine. Emily remained still beside him, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer composed, it was careful, her shoulders slightly drawn in, her hands resting lightly instead of firmly, as if she were uncertain where to place them, where to place herself in this new understanding. I kept my gaze lowered for a moment longer, then lifted it just enough to take in the room again. The same walls, the same table, the same filtered light through the tall windows, but everything within it had shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to directly, but in a way that could be felt in every silence, every pause between words. Mr. Harrison closed the folder gently, the soft sound marking an end that did not feel like an ending at all, more like a transition, a line drawn between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, the sound controlled but unnecessary, an attempt to fill a silence that did not need filling, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, might question, might try to reshape what had just been laid out, but he did not, perhaps because he understood that there was nothing to reshape, nothing to challenge without revealing more than he intended. Emily glanced at him again, more directly this time, her expression searching, but he did not meet her eyes immediately, and that hesitation, that brief delay, spoke more than any explanation could have. I allowed myself a slow breath, steady and measured, feeling the final piece settle into place, not with force, not with triumph, but with clarity, because this was never about a single moment, it was about everything that had led to it, everything that had been quietly building beneath the surface, and now, it was visible, not just to me, but to all of us. I adjusted my handbag slightly on my lap, a small, ordinary movement that grounded the moment in something simple, something real, because even in situations like this, it is the ordinary gestures that carry the most control, the most intention. I did not speak, I did not need to, the room itself had already said enough. Daniel shifted once more, then finally looked up, not at Mr. Harrison, but toward me, his expression measured, searching for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps confirmation, perhaps even weakness, but I offered him none of it. I met his gaze briefly, calmly, without challenge, without invitation, and then I looked away, because what he was looking for no longer mattered. Emily followed that exchange, her eyes moving between us, her expression uncertain, as if she were trying to understand something that no longer fit into the version of events she had accepted, and I realized then that this was where the true shift had occurred, not in the document, not in the words that had been read, but in the space between us, in the understanding that had changed without needing to be spoken. They had walked into that room believing they were waiting for something inevitable, something that would arrive in its own time without resistance. But now they understood, even if only partially, that nothing about this was passive, nothing about it was guaranteed. I rose slowly from my chair, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving forward as the moment required, and I gathered my things with the same quiet care I had brought into the room, because control is not something you declare, it is something you demonstrate, in the smallest actions, in the way you choose to move when everything else has shifted. And as I turned toward the door, I did not look back, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question. They would have their time to think, to reconsider, to understand what had just happened, but I already knew, I understood it fully. They had been waiting for my life to quietly conclude so theirs could begin more comfortably, but what they had not realized, what they were only just beginning to see, was that I was not something to wait out, I was something to reckon with, and by the time they truly understood that, the decisions would no longer be theirs to influence, they would simply have to live with them.